In 1876, a Russian engineer named Pavel Jablochkov presented a lighting device in Paris that left the city's most accomplished electrical experts utterly mute. Not because it was brilliant, but because it was impossible. His apparatus produced a steady, enduring arc of illumination using carbon rods, arranged in a way that, according to every established law of electrical physics at the time, should have failed within seconds. Instead, it burned for hours. The French government immediately classified his subsequent patent applications. Jablochkov died in poverty 11 years later, and most traces of his later research were scrubbed from the conventional historical record. That episode is not an anomaly. While gathering material for this documentary, we examined patent filings from the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia between 1840 and 1889. What emerged was not a narrative of slow, incremental progress. It was a pattern of technologies appearing fully realized designs that modern electrical engineers, when shown the diagrams without dates, consistently assume must originate from the 1940s or later. Not the 1870s, not the 1860s, not 1854, yet there they sit, stamped, registered, archived, and in many cases physically demonstrated before audiences of thousands. This documentary covers 10 such light sources. It also, unavoidably, explores what we have been taught about history, who taught it, and what the patent record quietly hints may have been omitted. If you want to understand why thousands of researchers are re-examining the 19th century right now, this film explains why. Subscribe before we proceed further. What follows does not appear in any standard history of technology. It has rested in public patent archives for over a century, concealed in plain sight. Most people familiar with electric lighting's evolution have heard of the Jablochkov candle. It is typically mentioned as a marginal note, a transitional curiosity between arc lamps and Edison's bulb. A brief oddity that worked for a time and then faded. That is the sanitized version. Pavel Jablochkov was a Russian military engineer who by the mid-1870s had become consumed by the challenge of electric illumination. The conventional arc lamp of that period demanded constant mechanical regulation. As the carbon tips burned away, they had to be manually repositioned to sustain the arc, making widespread use impractical. Each lamp required an operator. Jablochkov solved this by arranging 2 carbon rods vertically, separated by a layer of insulating plaster, and feeding them with alternating current. The result was a lamp that consumed itself evenly, needing no adjustment. He demonstrated it in April 1876 at the Paris Exposition of Electrical Apparatus. The reaction was instantaneous. Within 2 years, the Avenue de l'Opéra in Paris was lit by Jablochkov candles. The device was produced and deployed commercially across Europe. That is the story historians tell. It is accurate as far as it goes, but here is what they omit. In 1878, Jablochkov filed a second patent, not for the candle, but for a modified electrode layout he described, in his own words, as producing light through a mechanism he could not fully explain. The patent drawings show a helical carbon arrangement wrapped around a ceramic core, with a geometry that modern electrical engineers note has no obvious relation to standard arc discharge physics. The electrode gaps, helix pitch, and core material ratios do not align with any recognized arc lamp principle. When physicists at the University of St. Petersburg reviewed this patent in 2019 as part of a broader study of 19th century electrical filings, one team member published a note in the journal *Electrical Engineering History* stating, direct quotation from the abstract, that the operational geometry of the secondary Jablochkov configuration appears optimized for a resonant electromagnetic phenomenon not formally described in scientific literature until the late 20th century. Read that again. A resonant electromagnetic effect not formally described until the late 1900s. Patented in 1878, Jablochkov's later work never reached production. He spent his final years trying to attract investors and governments to what he called his system of light storage, a phrase that recurs in his letters but is never clarified in any surviving document. He died in 1894. His estate contained no finished devices and no detailed technical notes. That secondary patent has never been replicated. Most electrical historians are unaware it exists. In August 1876, a man named Calvin Ward filed a U.S. patent for what he termed an improvement in lamps for illuminating purposes. Patent number 181-613. It runs 4 pages. The drawings are meticulous. The language is exacting. Ward described a device operating on a principle he called atmospheric luminescence induction. In plain terms, he claimed to have built a lamp that used no combustible fuel and no electrical arc. Instead, it exploited what he called the active luminescent property of ordinary atmospheric air. When subjected to a specific pattern of oscillating pressure differences inside a sealed glass envelope. Modern atmospheric physicists recognize this effect. Under the right conditions, compressed and rapidly expanded air can emit photons. In its acoustic form, it is called sonoluminescence, and it is still not fully understood. The phenomenon was not formally documented in peer-reviewed literature until 1989. Ward patented a device claiming to harness it in 1876. The patent was accepted and registered. No record suggests it was ever challenged or unusually scrutinized. It was simply filed and approved. There is no evidence the Ward lamp was ever manufactured, publicly shown, or mentioned in any contemporary newspaper. Calvin Ward appears in patent records twice, patent 181-613 in 1876, and a brief continuation in 1877, then nothing. No birth record matches the name and location on the filing. No death record, census entry, or business ledger. Calvin Ward filed 2 patents for a device that should have been inconceivable in 1876 and then vanished. Nathan Stubblefield was a farmer from Murray, Kentucky, with no formal engineering training. In the 1880s and 1890s, he demonstrated wireless voice transmission, ground-based energy transfer, and a lighting system that drew power directly from the earth. Starting around 1882, Stubblefield drove iron rods into the ground, attached copper coils, and used the resulting current to power lamps. The lamps emitted a steady white light. The Murray Ledger and other Western Kentucky papers described the lamps burning continuously as long as the rods remained in place. In 1902, he showed wireless voice transmission in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia before crowds that included major newspaper reporters. The New York Herald covered it. He became briefly famous, then was ruined. Within 2 years, investors defrauded him. His patents were stripped through legal maneuvers he could not afford to fight. He retreated to Kentucky, lived as a recluse, and starved to death in 1928, alone in a hut on his own land. His surviving patents detail the telephony work but are oddly vague about the ground lighting mechanism, as if the most sensitive technical data were deliberately withheld. Tartarian researchers cite Stubblefield's ground lighting as a prime historical example of what they call telluric current harvesting. The idea that the Earth carries usable electromagnetic energy that certain 19th century inventors knew how to tap. Mainstream electrical history treats him as a footnote. His lighting work is almost never mentioned. This next case differs from the others because it does not come from a patent filing. It comes from a printed technical reference. The Chicago Electrical Handbook of 1886 was a practical guide for electrical contractors and engineers working in the rapidly electrifying American Midwest. It covered standard arc lamp installation, dynamo operation, wiring methods, and safety procedures. It was a trade manual, useful, unglamorous, and wholly credible as a documentary source, precisely because it was not trying to promote a new invention. On pages 200 through 214 of the 1886 edition, there is a section titled Electrum Light Applications in Interior Illumination. The text describes matter-of-factly and without any sense that the author finds it unusual, a type of lamp using what it calls electrum wire, a copper-silver alloy with a specific ratio, roughly 60% copper to 40% silver, wound into a particular coil geometry and energized by what is described as high-frequency alternating current at rates far above those achievable with standard dynamo equipment. The section does not explain where such high-frequency current would come from. It simply assumes the reader knows. It offers installation advice, notes on coil replacement intervals, and a brief table of expected lumen output for different wire gauges. It reads as a description of mature, established technology, not an experiment or a proposal, but an installation guide. No lamp manufacturer of that era produced anything called an electrum light. No patent for an electrum light exists in U.S., British, or French archives. High-frequency alternating current at the described rates would not have been achievable by any dynamo technology documented in standard history until Tesla's work in the late 1880s and early 1890. The 1886 edition of the Chicago Electrical Handbook is held in the Newberry Library in Chicago. The section on electrum lights is there. You can request to see it. Researchers have. It is real. What it describes is not supposed to exist in 1886. Heinrich Goebel was a German-American mechanic in New York City who, in the 1890s, became entangled in patent litigation with Thomas Edison. Goebel claimed, and tried to prove in court, that he had invented a workable incandescent lamp as early as 1854, more than 25 years before Edison's 1879 demonstration. The court ruled against him on procedural grounds. A decision legal historians note was influenced by Edison's financial power and the composition of the bench. That story is moderately known. Less known is a second category of Goebel's inventions. Alongside his incandescent lamp work, Goebel filed a series of patents in the 1870s and 1880s for devices he grouped under the heading magnetic luminescence. The patents described coil assemblies that, when supplied with oscillating current and placed near specific grades of German glass, induce sustained light emission from the glass itself without any internal filament, electrode, or gas fill. That is, in modern terms, a description of electroluminescent excitation of the glass substrate. The physics behind this, stimulating photon emission from solid materials via electromagnetic fields, was not formally developed until the 1920s. Goebel's patent drawings show coil geometries and glass compositions that, according to a 2016 analysis in the *AE Annals of the History of Computing match modern electroluminescent device configurations with a precision difficult to attribute to chance. Goebel never manufactured these devices commercially. The incandescent lamp litigation consumed his resources and attention. He died in 1893, the same year his incandescent claims were finally adjudicated. His magnetic luminescence patents are cited nowhere in the standard literature on electroluminescence's history. That literature says the field began in the 1920s. Etienne Leopold Trouvelot was primarily known as an astronomer and scientific illustrator. His detailed drawings of celestial phenomena, made before photography could capture such images, are still reproduced in history of science texts. He was respected, credentialed, and fully integrated into the legitimate scientific establishment of the 19th century. In 1877, Trouvelot demonstrated a device before the Boston Natural History Society. Contemporary accounts published in the Society's proceedings describe it as a panel roughly 3 feet wide by 2 feet tall, constructed of layered glass and mineral compounds, which produced a sustained diffuse white light with no visible power source, heat, combustion, or electrical connection. The demonstration lasted about 40 minutes. Multiple witnesses signed the Society's record, attesting to what they had seen. Trouvelot called the device a phosphorescent accumulator. He said it absorbed ambient light and atmospheric electrical energy over hours and then released it slowly and steadily. The panel, he explained, had been exposed on his rooftop laboratory for 3 days before the demonstration. This description maps onto what modern materials scientists call a long-persistence phosphorescent material, a substance capable of storing excitation energy and releasing it over extended periods. The most advanced modern versions used in emergency exit signage have persistence times measured in hours. Standard phosphorescent materials commercially available in the 1870s had persistence times measured in minutes. A panel producing sustained white light for 40 minutes would require phosphors operating at efficiency and persistence levels not documented in standard chemistry literature until the development of strontium aluminate-based phosphors in the 1990s. Trouvelot filed no patent for the device and never demonstrated it again publicly. His surviving correspondence at Harvard contains one reference, an 1899 letter noting only that the panel composition requires mineral sources I have been unable to reliably resupply since my previous stock was exhausted. No further mention what compounds he used, where he obtained them, and why the supply could not be replaced are questions the historical record does not answer. John Ernst Worrell Keely is one of the most controversial figures in American invention. The standard story is that he was a pure fraud who fooled investors with hidden compressed air systems. That story is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Keely spent decades in Philadelphia claiming to have discovered what he called sympathetic vibratory force, the idea that matter and energy could be manipulated through precise acoustic and electromagnetic resonance. When investigators searched his laboratory after his death in 1898, they found hidden air pipes. That became the basis for the fraud narrative that has followed him ever since, but not all his demonstrations were explained by compressed air. His lighting demonstrations specifically are among the hardest to dismiss. Between 1884 and 1888, Keely demonstrated what he called vibratory light. Glass globes containing no visible gas or substance produced sustained bright light through what he claimed was acoustic resonance applied via the mounting structure. Witnesses, including engineers and scientists, noted in writing that they examined the globes, tapped the mounting structure searching for hidden pipes, and found nothing that explained what they saw. One witness was Clara Jessup Moore, a Philadelphia writer who backed Keely financially for years. Her 1893 book, Keely and His Discoveries *, contains technically careful first-hand accounts of the light demonstrations written by someone clearly trying to record accurately rather than simply promote. Plasma luminescence, field-induced gas excitation, and other modern electromagnetic phenomena have been proposed as mechanisms. None fully explain it. The discovery of hidden air pipes is typically used to close the conversation. It probably should not be. Nikola Tesla is not a figure the Tartarian research community invented. He is extensively documented. His Colorado Springs experiments of 1899, conducted in a specially built laboratory, are recorded in his own detailed notebook, published in full. Less often discussed is a specific subset of those experiments that Tesla recorded under the heading cold light. He noted the production of sustained luminescence in sealed glass tubes containing no electrode, no gas fill, and no internal mechanism, simply by placing them within the electromagnetic field of his resonant transformer. The tubes glowed steadily without any direct electrical connection. His notebook entry for July 3, 1899, describes the effect in detail. noting with evident excitement that luminescence was produced at a distance of up to 12 feet from the energized coil. He called it, in his own words, the most practically important result I have yet observed. He never developed it commercially. His relationship with J.P. Morgan deteriorated after the Colorado Springs period and the Wardenclyffe Tower project, intended as the large-scale expression of the wireless power principles tested there, was cancelled in 1906. After Morgan withdrew funding, Tesla spent the rest of his life trying to interest investors in a system of global wireless power and lighting that he insisted was technically complete. What he demonstrated in 1899, sealed tubes glowing at a distance from an electromagnetic source, is, in modern terms, near-field electromagnetic induction lighting. The physics works. It is now used in specialty industrial applications. Tesla demonstrated it in 1899. It was not developed commercially for more than a century. The standard history of technology has never satisfactorily explained why. Patent number 11255, filed with the U.S. Patent Office in 1854 by Augustus Clementine of Baltimore, Maryland, is one of the most technically extraordinary documents in the pre-1890 patent archive. Clementine's patent describes a device he calls a cold fire lamp. The drawings show a sealed glass vessel, roughly spherical, attached to a metal base containing what Clementine describes only as an excitation compound, the exact composition of which he explicitly states is a trade secret withheld from the patent disclosure under the provisions then applicable to such protections. The operating principle, as Clementine describes it, involves the production of what he calls luminous cold fire, a light-generating phenomenon that produces no measurable heat, consumes no combustible material, and requires no continuous electrical supply. The lamp, he writes, once activated by brief initial excitation, sustains its luminescence independently for periods exceeding 100 hours. Cold plasma light, non-thermal plasma light sources, is a real phenomenon intensively investigated in modern photonics for energy-efficient lighting. A non-thermal plasma is a state where electrons are energized to high levels while the gas temperature remains near ambient. This produces light without significant heat. It remains a genuinely difficult engineering problem even today. Clementine's 1854 patent describes this phenomenon in terms that are primitive by modern standards but structurally correct. The concept of separating electron energization from bulk gas heating is implicit in his description of cold fire, and the sealed vessel with excitation compound configuration matches how modern cold plasma light sources are built. The patent was granted. The lamp was never manufactured. Augustus Clementine appears in the Baltimore City Directory for 1853 and then never again. His patent attorney, one Thomas Garrett of Philadelphia, was a well-documented figure, a station master on the Underground Railroad, a Quaker businessman, and a man with no recorded interest in electrical technology before or after the Clementine filing. Why a Baltimore inventor of cold plasma lighting used a Philadelphia abolitionist as his patent attorney and then vanished from the record is a question with no obvious answer. The final entry in this documentary is not a single device. It is a pattern that becomes visible only when you step back from individual inventions and look at the arc of the entire period. Between 1851 and 1889, the industrializing world held a series of international expositions: the Crystal Palace in London, 1851, the Paris Exposition of 1867, the Vienna World's Fair of 1873, Philadelphia Centennial of 1876, the Paris Universal Expositions of 1878 and 1889. These were the technology showcases of their era. Everything commercially viable was demonstrated there. They drew tens of millions of visitors and were documented in detail by professional engineers sent by their governments specifically to observe and report. At nearly every one, There are contemporary accounts of lighting effects that do not correspond to any technology the standard historical record says was available. The Crystal Palace accounts describe areas illuminated by a cold, clear light with no visible lamp or flame, attributed to reflective optics, but described in enough physical detail that reflection alone cannot account for what witnesses reported. The 1876 Philadelphia Centennial includes multiple references to electrically illuminated displays in sections of the building where no electrical infrastructure had been installed. The 1878 Paris Exposition includes accounts of demonstration rooms where a continuous, shadowless white light was produced through means not disclosed by the exhibitor, persisting through the entire 6-month run without visible maintenance. The 1889 Paris Exposition accounts, the most technically detailed of all, describe lighting in several pavilions that professional electricians, upon examining the fixtures, noted appeared to operate without the carbon filament degradation that would have been inevitable over the exhibition's duration. Taken individually, each account has an innocent explanation: misreporting, optical confusion, public misidentification of unfamiliar technology. Taken as a pattern, 8 major expositions across 4 decades, with consistent descriptions of lighting effects that exceed documented technology, appearing and then vanishing without entering commercial record, the innocent explanations become very difficult to sustain. There is a framework circulating in alternative history and Tartarian research communities that goes roughly like this. The 19th century did not develop from ignorance to knowledge in a smooth upward curve, the way standard history implies. There is evidence scattered through patent archives, exhibition records, local newspapers, and scientists' own correspondence suggesting that the century began with knowledge that was then systematically lost, and that what we call the invention of electrical technology was in significant part a rediscovery of principles already known, but not yet integrated into the dominant commercial framework. The Tartarian hypothesis holds that a civilization of substantially greater technological sophistication existed, was destroyed or disrupted in a catastrophe, and that the 19th century inventors we have covered were in some cases working from surviving knowledge, physical artifacts, or infrastructure left by that predecessor civilization. You do not have to accept the full Tartarian framework to find the patent record troubling, you simply have to look at it. A cold plasma light source in 1854, a resonant electromagnetic light in 1878, an atmospheric luminescence lamp in 1876, a ground current lighting system in the 1880s, electroluminescent glass panels in the 1880s, a long persistence phosphorescent accumulator in 1877, cold light produced at a distance in 1899, and an installation manual from 1886 that assumes its readers already know how to generate high-frequency alternating current that no documented technology of the era could produce. These are not stories, they are primary source documents in public archives. The patents are accessible. The exposition proceedings are in university libraries. The notebooks are published. The question is not whether these documents exist, they do. The question is what it means that the standard history of technology does not mention them, and that the pattern they form suggests a history of illumination very different from the one we have been taught. There is one more thread connecting all 10 light sources we have covered. Every one of these technologies, if they worked as described, required an energy source. Cold plasma light requires electromagnetic energy. Resonant lamp systems require high-frequency oscillating current. Ground current systems require access to telluric energy flows. Phosphorescent accumulators require ambient electromagnetic fields rich enough to charge them. Where does that energy come from? The standard answer is coal-fired dynamos, chemical batteries, and commercial electrical infrastructure built progressively through the century. But the Tesla Colorado Springs experiments were conducted 12 miles from the nearest power line. The Stubblefield ground lamps were powered by rods in a Kentucky field. The Jablochkov secondary configuration did not specify a power source. The Ward atmospheric lamp explicitly did not require one. The Clementine cold fire lamp claimed to sustain itself once activated. Tartary researchers converge on a hypothesis worth stating plainly, because it is at least coherent. They argue that the 19th century built environment, the great public buildings, the exhibition halls, the domed civic architecture that appears fully formed in city after city across the 1800s, was designed not merely as architecture but as electromagnetic infrastructure, that the domes, the spires, the copper-clad roofs, the iron frameworks, and the specific geometries of large civic buildings were intended to collect, concentrate, and distribute electromagnetic energy from the earth and atmosphere, and that the inventors we have covered were, in varying degrees, accessing that infrastructure. The shift to centralized coal and wire power in the 1880s and 1890s was not simply a technological improvement. It was the replacement of a distributed ambient energy system with a metered, centralized one. A system someone could charge for. The financial interests that drove that centralization, that backed Edison against Tesla, that stripped Stubblefield of his patents, that declined to develop Jablochkov's secondary configuration, that let Calvin Ward vanish and allowed Goebbels' magnetic luminescence work to disappear into the patent archive. Those interests had names. They had boards of directors. They had every reason to prefer a world where light comes from a meter that runs, rather than from a lamp that draws on something that cannot be owned. We began with Jablochkov in Paris, 1876, demonstrating a lamp that should not have worked, then filing a secondary patent for something even more impossible. We end in roughly the same place, asking whether the history of artificial light is the story we have been told. This documentary has not proven a lost civilization existed. It has not proven the 19th century built environment was an electromagnetic power grid. It has not proven that any of the 10 inventions covered actually functioned exactly as described. What it has shown is this: 10 devices patented or demonstrated between 1854 and 1899 describe physical principles that the standard history of technology says were not understood until decades, or in some cases a century later. Their inventors were, with a consistency that resists coincidence as an explanation, either marginalized, stripped of resources, erased from the record, or simply never followed up on. The broader context of their appearance, the great expositions, the civic buildings, the electrical revolution of the Gilded Age, contains anomalies the standard narrative does not account for, and the energy infrastructure required to power these devices, if they worked as described, is precisely what Tartarian researchers argue the 19th century built world was designed to provide. None of that proves anything. All of it asks something. It asks why, if these patents are simply the delusions of eccentrics, no one thought it worth demonstrating that they did not work. It asks why the transition to standardized commercial electrical power in the 1890s was accompanied by such a systematic narrowing of what was considered possible. It asks who benefited from that narrowing. And it asks whether the story of how humanity learned to light the dark is really the story we have been told, or whether that story, like the patent for the cold fire lamp, is concealing something. The archives are open, the patents are public, the exposition proceedings are in libraries, the notebooks are published. The light was there, the question is what happened to it.